good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, wherever you're coming in from. Thank you so much for being with us today. As you join, can you please type in the chat where you're coming from today and how many people are watching with you, and if you are able, the native language you occupy. And if you're a host from an in-person site, feel free to chat a single check-in from where you are and how many are in the room. And if you wish, ask audience members to shout it out where they're coming from today to you, and you can put it in the stream here. So let's have your voices. Great. We have Liz in Westchester, 1. We have Jillian in Oak Park, 1. Thanks for being here. Mary in California, just herself. We've got John in Oak Park. We have Jing in Hawaii. Wonderful. Isabella in Chicago. Ashley, Chicago. Karen, Chicago. Paul in Wheeling. Wendy in Evanston. Mark in Oak Park. Rashika in Chicago. Silver in Chicago. This is great. Keep this coming. We love to see you fill this room, this virtual room. This is beautiful. We're going to have a great day today. Thank you so much. So I'm Anna Garcia Doyle, and I'm the executive director of One Earth Collective, which produces the One Earth Film Festival. Welcome to this festival screening event. We hope it'll provide all of us with rich opportunities for learning, a brave and safe space for important conversations, and a way to move from inspiration to action. So the thing that struck me most in this relatively short but high impact hour-long film, Life at 50 Degrees, that's Celsius, is that climate change is already affecting most of us around the world, whether we realize it or not. Also, it made me think about how climate change's impacts affect marginalized communities most, though all of us do or will feel its effects in terms of our health, how we live and make our living, and more. So those are just some things that struck me. I'll be very interested to hear what struck you. Just a moment for us to recognize our sponsors and partners. We really couldn't do this work without you. So thank you to WBEZ Chicago and Vocalo, the Field Museum, Swazi Saxena of Baird and Warner, Environmentalists of Color, Go Green Barrington, and the University of Chicago Phoenix Sustainability Institute and the Committee on Campus Sustainability. And just one last quick note here, if your circumstances allow, please donate to support One Earth's nonprofit year-round screening events, youth programs, and more at oneearthfilmfest.org.
We gratefully welcome you to One Earth's 11th festival season, and we invite you to join us in turning the tide on our climate crisis. The festival uses the power of film to create a sea change on topics of environment and those intersected with environment, like racial, social, and economic justice. This year, we've adapted a hybrid format where all screenings are virtual, with some accompanying in-person events taking place in the Chicago area. Whether live or virtual, we remain committed to our unique model of gathering and community to raise awareness of the issues, engage in dialogue, and be inspired to act. A powerful image and call to collective action in light of this year's festival theme, Turn the Tide, are the words of Japanese writer Ryunosuke Satoru. Individually, we are one drop. Together, we are an ocean. Our event will take place in 4 parts. Soon, we'll introduce you to some folks who will help us have a rich discussion after the film. Then, we'll watch the film together. After the film, we'll unpack its themes in a facilitated dialogue with our panelists. Please use the chat to share your thoughts, ideas, or questions. We'll end by sharing concrete actions you can take to be part of the solution. These suggested actions come from our panelists and action partners. I'd now like to make a few brief acknowledgments. The first is that, as we reframe narratives around justice, environment, and equitable solutions to our climate crisis, we acknowledge the many filmmakers, film subjects, facilitators, and panelists joining this and other Fest events. Thank you. Your wisdom and experiences help us spark and sustain actions for the protection of our One Earth and for the just treatment of its resources and its people. The second acknowledgement is that One Earth Collective is based in Chicago, the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, and home to many other tribes, including today, peoples from over 100 tribal nations. Despite this, there are currently no federally recognized tribes in Illinois, due in part to colonization, relocation, and genocide. One Earth sustains its commitment to presenting films that center Indigenous stories and voices. We believe that beyond acknowledging the native lands we each occupy, we must lift up Indigenous voices and support the work of First Nations groups. If you're in the Chicago area, please support the important work being done by the American Indian Center Chicago, the Chicago American Indian Community Collaborative, Chi Nations Youth Council, and others. And watch for the Field Museum exhibition Native Truths, Our Voices, Our Stories, co-curated with collaborators from more than 100 tribes, opening this May. A third acknowledgement is that shared agreements can help keep our conversations safe and respectful. Please observe the following agreements when participating. Put aside your preconceptions, acknowledge your privilege, internalize what you've learned, approach the conversation with respect, engage your active listening, use I statements and get comfortable with your own story. One last thing before we meet our facilitator and program participants. If you're active on social media, tell people that this is happening. Amplify these voices and be a part of the community we're building here together. The hashtags for the festival are hashtag OEFF 2022 and hashtag Turn the Tide. And now I'd like to turn it over to our facilitator to introduce themselves, the panelists, and our film.
Thanks so much, Anna, for such a warm introduction. My name is Kyra Woods, and I am thrilled to join this 11th year of the One Earth Film Festival. I am a proud Chicagoan. I'm from the south side of this beautiful city. And for those of you who are joining us from the city, I hope that you've enjoyed the wonderful weather we're having today. And for all of those who are joining from other cities and even potentially other countries, we hope that you find this film and this discussion really enriching and something that you can also share with those in your community at home. I'm very, very grateful to not only be able to share this virtual space with you, but we also have an in-person audience. And as Anna mentioned in the introduction, we are able to couple these virtual screenings with a few in-person events as well. And so I'd like to take a moment to welcome our audience at U Chicago.
Hi, I'm Jess from the Phoenix Sustainability Initiative.
And I'm Suzanne from the Committee on Campus Sustainability.
And we're hosting a screening from U Chicago in the Ida Noyes Hall. Happy to join everyone.
Awesome. We're so glad that they can also join us in person for a really great hybrid model this year. The last 2 years have been tough, but we are so grateful that you're joining us in this virtual setting. And for the students, the faculty, and family and friends who may be down there, thanks for joining us. We'll have a chance actually to still engage with them via chat after the film. So I truly encourage you to stay for a truly engaging and a really rich conversation, both in the chat and with our panelists as well. Let's go on to the next slide briefly, and we'll be just about ready to start the film. It's a quick request for our in-person audience at U Chicago. We ask that you put your phones on airplane mode now so that we can optimize the film stream. We want to do our best to stay in sync and truly have that in-theater feel with one another. Now it's time to enjoy the film, and it will be preceded by a brief message from our sponsors with WBEZ, Chicago Public Radio, and Vocalo. I'll see you after the film for our conversation. Welcome back, everyone. I know that as we just take a moment and let those final credits and last scenes settle in, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, that was a rather powerful film. And what's so interesting is that it really honed in on just the impacts of extreme heat as an effect of our changing climate. And even though we walked through 7 different countries, its impact on our just societies, our communities, and individual people was truly felt as a part of that film. Before we get started in our discussion this afternoon, I'm going to invite you to scan the QR code on the screen. This is both for our in-person audience that is joining us from the University of Chicago, as well as those who may be in the virtual space as well. By scanning the QR code from your phone, you'll be able to engage in the chat. Or you could just directly use the Vimeo chat that you've been using thus far as well. We wanted to be sure to start with that so that we can start our discussion. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide and give folks a couple of seconds to get that settled. But we definitely want to make time to just reflect on some of these initial moments. So can we go on to the next slide? All right. So I invite you in the chat, again, whether you're using the Vimeo function or the new QR chat, to share what you are reflecting on, what's resonating with you. So the question that we ask in this space is, what are some of the scenes, people, or lines from the film that you remember? And I'll be capturing some of those here in the chat and reading them as they come along. Oh, yeah. Some really, great feedback thus far. All right, give me just 1 second. Keep these ideas coming. And again, we have an audience joining us from across the country. So as you're reflecting and maybe making some connections from your own city, that's great. All right. Let's go ahead and give folks a few more minutes to try to offer some thoughts. Again, the question is, what are some of the scenes, people, or lines in the film that you remember? Nicole shares that she remembers the animals eating cardboard. That was a striking moment from the film. I actually did a double take when I saw that too, Nicole. I said, oh my. Karen is sharing that she remembers men digging an entire new well just to get water for their family. Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's give just a few more minutes for folks to share what, again, is resonating with you from the film. Ashley shares that what sticks out to her is that poor people are the ones who are being more affected than those who are rich. Absolutely. The climate scientist was the one who made that connection for us as she was explaining not only the impacts, but who was feeling those impacts more intensely, and then who was actually driving the issue anyway. That is rather striking. Feel free to continue to share your input as those reflections really sit in. And maybe if you're watching with others, maybe you're discussing together. So feel free to drop further comments in the chat. But at this time, I do want to invite our two panelists back to the virtual stage so that we can learn with and from them. I'll first introduce Amaris Alanis-Ribeiro. She works with the Chicago Park District and Climate for Health. Amaris is an urban naturalist that advocates for equity, health, and climate action. She's currently the project lead for a Thriving Earth Exchange community science project with climate refugees here in Chicago. Thanks so much for joining us today, Amaris, for the conversation.
Thank you, Kyra.
Also, of course, I'll also introduce Raed Mansour, who works with the Chicago Department of Public Health. Raed is the Director of Environmental Innovation at the Chicago Department of Public Health, or CDPH, and a member of the Board of Directors at Open Lands. He has helped build community relationships that bring public health and trees together to improve health equity and the quality of life for residents. And he does this as a way to ensure that all residents can benefit firsthand from what nature has to offer. Thanks for joining us today, Raed. Of course. All right. So we'll start with a few questions for our panelists, but of course, our audience, we invite you to also be a part of this. You're encouraged to share your questions in the chat, and they can be to a particular panelist if you'd like, or they can be a reflection or something that either one of them can answer as well. Also, the chat is a great way to learn with one another. So again, we ask that you keep that a safe space, even though it's virtual and it's a cyber context, but we really do ask that you have some basic rules of engagement and respect for one another. But if you have input or experience or knowledge, we encourage you to have dialogue in the chat as well. All right, so you both are here in Chicago, and I'm grateful that I've had an opportunity to work with each of you before. But I would love to hear from you. What were some of the scenes, lines, or people from the film that stick out for you? Let's go with Amaris first.
Sure. Well, definitely resonated with some of the viewers who added on the chat some of the lines and scenes that really impacted them. I would probably add, for me, my family is from Mexico, so they immigrated here. And when, it just hit closer to home when I saw scenes that were in Mexico. I can hear the Spanish, the little nuances that don't always get translated perfectly in English. That really resonated with me, both whether it was, a bigger city or a smaller town or a local indigenous community, and just how the climate has affected them. I definitely just made me think of how it affects my current family that still lives in Mexico, as well as my parents and why they potentially immigrated here to the US.
Thank you for sharing that. That is such a personal story. And in a city like ours, which draws so many people from different parts of the world, I know you're not alone, right? Yeah, thanks for sharing that. What about you, Raed?
I think it parallels Amaris's story too. I was born in Jordan and my parents were farmers. So part of that movie from Iraq and Kuwait really resonated. We, moved here to Chicago, actually, straight, and lived in the Southeast side. And so taking our history from the Middle East and my parents being farmers, and what else can they do when they come to a new country too? They worked in factories. And living in the Southeast side, and especially, environmental justice concerns, we have this lived shared experience. So, we share the same experiences, and it really tugged at my heart to see that farmer losing his land. And my parents had the same pressure to get rid of their land. When they came here, they actually, the people there no longer wanted to farm. They wanted to build apartments and stores and stuff. So the farming was being lost. So, when you look at what's going on with climate change and the results that are impacting the people, it really hits home.
Absolutely. I'm curious. And first, I'm very grateful for the grounding that you both are offering, that these stories are not just miles away, that these are our stories as well, and that the history that lies with them is not, again, also years ago. It is current. It is part of our history that brings us to the city. And the reasons are varied, right? And thinking about folks who migrate here or immigrate here, that's really important to consider. I'm curious to know what brought you personally to your work in the environmental space or climate space. And, feel free to share a little bit more about how you got to where you are now.
Sure, I'll go first if you don't mind. I was always a nature girl since I was little, and just living in the city, just finding the little nooks of nature, little patches. I loved spending time at the lake when my dad played soccer. I would, play in nature, and I also spent a lot of time going to Mexico, like not every summer, but maybe every 3 years. My parents are from Michoacan, so it was central Mexico and on a road trip all the way to Mexico with my family. So we would pull over, we would, spend time looking at the scenery, checking out the different places, and spending time on my mom's farm. So it was something for me that I wanted to immediately study. And in high school, as early as high school, I was, really interested in biology. I thought I wanted to be a doctor or a high school science teacher. And I was a pre-med track. But my career immediately was spending probably more time outdoors. So working in informal science centers and museums and outdoor spaces, that has been my career. But definitely I've always integrated the health, the equity, and the education. Currently I run a nature center, but it's all, you can see that kind of like that impact from my lived experiences in my career.
I love when that is able to happen. Good for you. And I'm sure even all of those STEM pieces, every once in a while, maybe not every once in a while, often you can lean on some of those pieces and bring it to your educational work too. Raed, what about you?
My career, it took a tortuous path. So there was not a direct line to it. I'll also just regarding Chicago parks, that's what we did when we were little. We spent all our time outdoors. And if it wasn't for the parks, I don't know what we would do. But besides that, career-wise, I studied neurobiology, animal physiology, and I was a genetic engineer. It has nothing to do probably with public health. So I was a researcher, a bench scientist back in the day when we had to wait for, bacteria cultures to grow, and we didn't have cell phones or internet. That's how old I am. So it was an exercise in patience, and I think it really helped in doing the work that I'm doing now. But it's that research aspect, I think, that really helped. I know when you say innovation, like what in the world does that mean? It's like a full
Tell us, what do we mean by innovation? What are you up to over there?
That word unfortunately is used so often that it loses its meaning. When you look at what it really means is to transform, to do something entirely different. And so what I usually work on is trying to find new methods, processes, policies, programs, and technology to solve problems. And I operate like a researcher, whether working with external partners and communities or internal within the city and like with yourself or parks too, as well. And see what works. We basically do proofs of concepts and then prototypes, maybe a pilot, and then a product, and it could be a service or a technology. So it requires a lot of patience. And some of the work that, I can give examples in,
Sure.
I mentioned trees in my bio. It's air quality. It's looking at heat vulnerability. It's looking at different ways to look at contracting. How do we inject equity in the work that we do, because that's newer for public health. And, taking into account now climate change, how do we identify things that we need to look at, and what are some of the solutions that we should start programming and creating policies for?
So I think your answers, both of your answers, are resonating with folks, because I see two pieces from the chat that are kind of interesting. Michael shares that if children can seldom go to a park or an outdoor space, it's another lost connection between people and their environment, right? And I too played soccer over at one of the forest preserves near my house, and gratefully lived within walking distance from a park district. And that's where we went for the summers, but we know that access may look different across different communities in Chicago, and definitely if you think about other cities as well. So that is, a consideration, Michael. How do we ensure that connection isn't lost as our spaces change as well? And I also see a question from William, and maybe Raed, you can think about this one, and Amaris, feel free to chime in too. He offers that climate policy decisions seem to hit people at the bottom first. What policy decisions can be made to help those people simultaneously with the climate? So maybe thinking about, how do we create policies that support climate, or people and planet?
Yeah, the policy decisions, you're right. I agree. And there are years of unjust practices that we have to untangle first. And at the same time, how do we create equity? And I think that is where it's changing now. In public health, we look at the whole population, but the starting point should be at those that are most vulnerable. And then we get into the discussion of what is vulnerability. And, we look at heat, and this is a perfect example of, at one point, you're not vulnerable, and now you are, because the change in climate. So identifying the vulnerable populations before. And I think when we look at this, we don't want to be reactive. How do we build resilience, and how do we solve these problems so that they don't become the first affected? They don't remain vulnerable. And how do we change this? And a lot of this is historic, where you have unjust practices, and in how even things are reported. To make things more understandable and easier to communicate. One of the hardest things in public health is prevention. Like telling someone to stop smoking, just by saying those words, that's not going to work. So, we have to get better at creating connections and relationships, and partner with the communities, not only to build trust, but to understand some of the things that we're hearing so that we can develop them into policies and programs. I think that's first and foremost. And that you see that happening when public health declared racism as a public health issue. When you now start from that point of honesty, I think then you can start being a better broker with the community to develop some of these policies and programs that'll be beneficial. We did through COVID. I used to say, if we help the vulnerable, we help everybody. So, that's always the starting point of everything that we do and work on. When you look at our tree equity work, the heat work, the climate work, that's our starting point. Yeah. And then, setting those policies up for success so that everyone benefits.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ensure that you named a few pieces. One was about vulnerability and exploring what that actually looks like. There's one scene from the movie or the film that I want to take us back to in a moment. And then the second thing that I thought was really notable was your point about making connections with community. And actually, maybe these are related. So the scene in the film that came to mind when you mentioned this was the emergency responders in, I believe, in Mexicali, where they were ultimately hosing the man or providing water to resuscitate him in some ways, right? And he was sleeping on the pavement. It seemed as if maybe he was trying to find shade under a piece of cardboard, but he seemed to not be responsive immediately. And in their response, they said, you know, if we weren't attentive, if somebody didn't come help this man, he may not have made it, right? And that, I think, is actually related to your point about connection with community, right? Because it's at that hyper-local level that people know their neighbors. They know where certain people may be resting or finding shade or going for help. And those community connections can be the lifeline in an emergency situation. And for something like heat, we in previous films, like Cooked, Survival by Zip Code, they frame that as a slow-moving disaster, where it may not look like the fire, but it may look like that hot day where someone who doesn't consider themselves as vulnerable is all of a sudden at risk and may not know who to call for help or may not have a connection to someone to help them. And so I want to bring Amaris's work into this as well. Amaris, I think you do a fantastic job at creating some of those community connections as well as education. Can you tell us a bit more about some of the programming, either through the Park District or the Nature Center specifically, where you lead that work, or even with some of your climate migration work? How are these conversations around community connection coming?
Sure, yeah. At the agency level, we are definitely tackling more concerns around health and wellness. Everyone has now acknowledged the importance that parks play in people's health, and especially during the pandemic. We've, definitely acknowledged that. So we've partaken in trainings that are around health equity. I also did a training on climate for health. So really not just doing like the regular recreation and nature track, but thinking about all the intersectionality of why we do this work, why we do what we do. And at the Nature Center, we've embarked on new ways of having a relationship with nature and people. So this idea of, yes, access is important and building a connection with nature is important, but you have to have this deeper reciprocal relationship with people and with your environment. I think the film talked about that, the relationship with land and very interesting ideas and concepts of like what that means for people and older generations. And we've lost some of that. And so we really need to rethink that. And so some of our work talks about like honoring trees, right? Talked about trees, like honoring trees, not just seeing trees as items for consumption for human use. We also do work with community organizations as a time banking project to do some exchanges. And most recently, as a climate health ambassador, and then taking on a new project through the Thriving Earth Exchange, I'll be working with the immigrant community from Chicago, and specifically Albany Park is the most diverse neighborhood of Chicago, one of the most diverse in the entire nation. And so when we're talking about vulnerable populations, the immigrant community is also, whether it's language, concerns of safety, just ability to navigate resources. It's something that I think it's important for us just to consider, because we might see more of that. I think we are, and we will see more of that, more of climate displacement. And that is important. And we saw in the film and in urban areas where people are moving from a completely different geography and potentially climate into a different area. And that's just something I think as a nature center, we connect people to urban nature, but we also have to see ourselves as activation sites for climate change action. So I'm hoping that people can see these connections of intersectionality and are wanting to redevelop their relationship with people and nature.
It's a really interesting vantage point, and one that I know resonates with me in terms of how we turn the tide, right? And in terms of community cohesion and safety and connected, that connection, right, in community is so important. But also that can be how we restore spaces, restore relationships, but, bring back life in a different way. And you're right, we saw several examples in the film of people making that choice to say, whether it's for health and like livelihood, right, and survival or economic opportunity, that people are moving. And this is not new, right? We've been seeing some of this for decades. And so it is really important, I think, for governments and other institutions and communities to really begin grappling with some of those questions about how do we support one another, and, particularly in spaces where people may come to, right? This may be a destination city. That's important. How are we going to balance that increase, right, of other residents and ensure that they have what they need too? So that's a really interesting example and great work. I look forward to seeing it evolve further in Albany Park. Okay, so let's also encourage others to ask questions in the chat. Your comments are valuable. We really do appreciate it. We'll take a few more before we move on. Jordan, I see your comment about mentioning the vulnerability piece again. You mentioned also, they mentioned that people who are experiencing drug addiction may be more vulnerable. It would be helpful if we viewed addiction as a symptom of disconnection, mental illness, and poverty rather than a moral failure. It's a really strong point. And as we think holistically about what that vulnerability means, and then in terms of what are the services to better support some of those communities. Thank you for your comment, Jordan. There is a question from Kathy. Just looked up how to change Celsius to Fahrenheit. Great point, Kathy. We did not tackle that. Thank you for sharing with the greater audience. Now I know that 50 degrees Celsius is equivalent to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. I might have missed this information earlier. You did not. I didn't say it. I'm sorry. But now that you know, and I thank you for sharing as well. Would either of you like to give, I don't know if you have examples of individuals, maybe like those that we saw in the film, or community groups or projects that are really trying to tackle this element of extreme heat, whether it's with trees or maybe it's park programming, maybe it's not even explicitly named cooling, but how are you involved with any work as it relates to extreme heat in Chicago and supporting residents? Raed, I'll kick it to you first since we just ended with Amaris, and I know we've peppered the conversation around some of your tree equity work. What does that look like? Or your work with Open Lands, because you all are a mighty group as well. So I'll start with you.
Sure. With respect to the tree work and driven by community, I think, the city of Chicago has their new tree equity program where they're investing a historic amount of money to plant more trees, but it's more than just planting. It's maintaining, preserving. It also centers around job training and workforce development and community engagement. And it's interesting, you talk about local groups that are doing this work as an example. And, the conservation organizations have shifted some of the way they approach conservation to address climate change, but you would expect that. I think when you look at community organizations, whether they're based in, if it's being trauma-informed or violence prevention, mental health, substance use, I'm noticing, and this has been going on for years, that they are shifting towards having green leads, talking about conservation or planting gardens for healing, to improve mental health and decrease anxiety and stress. And so they're already there. And it's nothing that, it's new to some, but they're on the ground. And so they're usually the innovative ones who are, reacting towards what's happening in climate change to them at that hyper-local level. And so we learn from them. And I think taking best practices from them and seeing if we can apply this across the city or in certain parts of the city, because they've been successful. I think looking at, even religious organizations are doing this as well. You have, whether it's Baptist or Muslim or any other faith, you see now green is part of being green, or having a green lead or some programming is part of their everyday work. And I think it's not one thing we should look at. I think we should take from all of it. I think those are where the solutions are existing, that we can hopefully emulate and support or identify gaps in other communities and show best practices that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The budget that you acknowledge is sizable. It's a historic investment for sure, upwards of 45, if not 46 million, I believe, but over time. And I think you make a valid point. It's not just about putting the trees in the ground, but also working with community to identify what other assets or what other programs exist to ensure that those trees can be taken care of and really valued by residents, and that they can be a part of that planting and care long term. So I look forward to seeing how that really continues to blossom over time. Amaris, I was thinking about how large the nature center is and how much land you all steward and manage. How does the conversation around either extreme heat or a cooling community space, does that show up in some of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the parks themselves are cooling areas, right? Both the green space and then the buildings for people. On a really hot day, our buildings are open for people to cool down. And I just think about, other vulnerable populations like the homeless, and how important this access of a 10-minute walk to a park is really critical in so many ways. And then just to go back to some other people who are doing work, we're also in a city. So I'm very proud of the green building movement in Chicago, because I think retrofitting and thinking of like how to build, both the building and around the building for, cooler cities, or just, to mitigate climate change and any efforts like that. I think that's another important move that we're doing in the city. And also going back to an earlier question around policy, very proud of just last year, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. And that's very absolutely centered equity. It, is quoted as the most equitable, policy. And so by design, jobs were number one priority, as well as those who would be most affected by the change of, having a focus on fossil fuel industry to now this green economy. Mm-hmm. So Illinois, Chicago, we're, both in terms of green and our built environment, it has to be hand in hand. And it really is one movement, Kyra. I think you called it one movement, whether we're calling it a green or conservation, thinking this way. Some people might not call it even climate change, but all of us, doing this work together will make that bigger impact for the city and, the state. And then also just being a model, as Raed was saying, like being a model and advocating in those ways.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that momentum, right? You need collaboration and innovation Raed, at all levels to make sure that we can have that full snowball effect. And so that state legislation, you're right, there are some things that are only legislated in that space. But we do feel those impacts here locally. So thinking about different ways to call for action, to really see those intersections between movements and not be too siloed, but understand that especially as residents, as humans, we feel all of those things in just our lived experience, right? And so we want to find those points of collaboration where possible to really have transformative change as well. I think I also saw a quick note from Debbie. Thank you so much for offering the resource around a report on mental health and climate change, an upcoming webinar, or the webinar link is in the chat as well, and a report link. Nicole, I think you raised a really great point about thinking fully about what we mean by vulnerable communities and how those, to Amaris's point, those experiencing homelessness may also have some particular concerns, right? And that governments or organizations may need to think critically about how to support that community. And then Nicole, you're raising the point about those who may have different varying levels of ability, right? So how do we best support our disability community and those who may be disproportionately impacted by climate as well? And so thinking about access, I think Amaris earlier, you mentioned language and navigating resources and really having that nimble ability to do that so that we're reaching as many people as possible, but primarily, I guess in a sense of priority as we think about equity, reaching those who may be at the highest risk of not receiving care or help as well. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move us on to a final question. And also as part of the One Earth Film Festival, it is important that we think about action. That is critical to the conversation as well. And we know that that is truly how change happens. So I will first offer this quote actually from our national, let's actually go back one more slide. I want to offer this quote from our national youth poet laureate, who is Amanda Gorman. She offers this quote in her piece, Earthrise, that there is no rehearsal. The time is now, now, now. Earth, pale blue dot, we will fail you not. And so as a final question for our panelists, I really wanted to ask you all, what actions can people take to be a part of the solution? And feel free to offer a suggestion that is something we can all do, or if you want to make it more focused for organizations or companies or governments, you can do that as well. So how can we be a part of the solution? Amaris, can I ask you to first close?
Sure. I'll start with definitely, that connection, both, with nature and people. I invite everyone to visit your local park, really spend time in the green spaces, visit North Park Village Nature Center, and if possible, join or create some type of mutual aid or type of network, so that we are thinking ahead of knowing our neighbors, knowing who's in need, and being able to support them in different types of situations. I just want everyone to be able to consider equity as important work and find those organizations that are working on climate justice, equity, immigrant issues. Those are all just very important areas that we can support.
Thanks. Raed, what about you?
I'm going to recommend North Park Village Nature Center only because it's in Albany Park where I live. This is not part of my recommendation, but I have to state this. They have the rare oak savanna. If you're in Chicago, this is how Chicago used to look. If you want to see it, it's very rare kind of ecosystem. Check it out. And if you want a history lesson, Amaris, I think your offices there used to be the Chicago Department of Public Health's old TB clinics. So it's very historic, beautiful park. I'm sorry, I digressed. I just had to do that. It's wonderful, great work there, Amaris. And to add to what we can do, connect with nature. It's the scientist in me that won't go away. One of the easiest things we can do is just observe your environment. And it's as simple as looking out the window. I borrow that from Hope Jaron, Lab Girl, where in the prologue, she begins her book by saying, you are a scientist, because if you observe and ask questions, that's how a scientist starts their investigation. So that's part of the research. Check out scistarter.org, and you can be a resident scientist. And they're not hard projects. It's something you do every day, and it connects you with nature to go outside. And I think that helps you find solutions, or help to be part of the solution, instead of, here we are always trying to do prevention and saying don't or can't or you shouldn't. Here's things you can do. You never know, it might spark an interest like it did with me. I started bird watching over COVID. And so it really just opened up a new, not even a hobby, it's just a passion now of working to protect more of nature. And then if you feel like you want to do more, check out openlands.org, where you could do anything from volunteer to take nature walks with them so they can point out what trees. They even have programs for teachers on how to teach kids about birds or nature. And maybe even you want to be a tree keeper and start learn how to plant trees and help your community. They're one of the organizations that help place trees within the parkway. And, I'm going to kind of tick off on what Amaris said about, your neighbor. One of the things we didn't talk about in heat, and something that happened in Chicago, was social cohesion. One of the risk factors were folks that didn't have anybody. No one checked up on them. They were older or elderly or sick. This seems simple enough, but you can see how tragic it can be. Back in 1995, a simple act of being a neighbor or getting to know your neighbors so that we all take care of one another.
Awesome. You walked us through so many different examples of ways to take action. I appreciate you both. That care for community and one another, I think, truly is important. And particularly in some of these climate conversations that can feel so weighty, right? We just did a world tour and saw some pretty harrowing scenes, right? So how can we ground ourselves or feel empowered to be a part of the change? So thank you for those various examples, and some that are right here at home. And again, for those who are joining us from other cities, I encourage you to think about some of the parallels in the cities or communities that you live in. We'll wrap up with this slide, almost wrapping up, but I want to be sure to offer a few more examples of ways to take action. Amaris and Raed shared some items from that top left box, connect with nature. Again, don't feel as if you have to frantically write these resources. We will share them after the festival, but the pieces that they mentioned will be a part of that resource set here. I also want to bring us to maybe the bottom left blue box, communicate, learn, and advocate. Here in Chicago, we are also working to update our climate action plan. As a city, we are undertaking the effort of updating our goals and targets, and there is an opportunity for residents to be a part of that process. So maybe you joined a town hall in January or did a survey on our website. There is one more opportunity for public comment, and it should go live next week. So stay tuned for more. Again, it will be an opportunity to offer public comments on the draft of our next climate action plan. You can go to chicago.gov/climate action plan for more information and for ways to get involved. And I want to lift up one other piece from this take action slide in the bottom right corner. Vote, organize, write, call. It is so important as we think about the upcoming elections and the ways that our society makes some of these decisions. And even like Raed mentioned, it's how we partner with people, where we spend money, what types of parks are restored and conserved as well. So think about those types of questions if you're in some of those political spaces, and as you think about the type of leadership that you want in community. I'll also lift one final object here, going back to the communicate, learn, and advocate box on the bottom left. One Earth is also hosting a virtual book discussion group. It launches on March 14th. And so they will be tackling All We Can Save. Again, it begins March 14th, and you can sign up at oneearthfilmfest.org. So these are just a few actions you can take, and I'm sure our audience, we've had a lot of people on this call today. I'm sure many of you take action in various ways. So finally, I invite you to share in the chat how you're feeling about this. I am ready to turn the tide by. As we close out, I would love to see in the chat what you are ready to do. Again, this is the theme for our 11th year as the One Earth Film Festival. It's turning the tide. And so we invite you to share in the chat the ways that you feel compelled to take action after this event. We look forward to seeing those suggestions roll in and those commitments roll in. We really appreciate your time, but feel free, go ahead. I'd like to see, how are you ready to turn the tide? Any action is helpful. Try starting a sustainability book club. Absolutely. Thanks so much, Debbie, for that comment. All right. I look forward to seeing some more of those come in. Of course, using the hashtag Turn the Tide. And if you're looking on social media, this is a great way to stay up to date with the festival and to see how others, even in other screenings, are committing to be a part of this change. We are so, so grateful. It looks like Anna is going to go visit the oak savannas that Raed mentioned. So be sure, you may see Raed out there and you may see Amaris. I'm sure they would both be more than happy to wave and say hello and show you some more sights on the property at the park. You know, it is beautiful. I highly suggest, if anybody has not been there, put that on your spring and summer list of things to do in Chicago. It looks like Susan is saying that she will plant some trees in the neighborhood. A number of them have been cut down. So I volunteer to pay for the trees and the city will plant. Thank you so much for that. In River Grove, great action item there. Jim, it looks like you're going to make an effort to get outdoors more often and learn about the natural world around you. Soon enough, you too will be a scientist like Raed, maybe. But we all have that capacity and capability. So thanks for getting out there. We encourage you to continue sharing, not only in the chat, we'll be around for a few more minutes, but again on social media. Feel free to use the hashtag OEFF2022 for this year's film festival, and of course the hashtag Turn the Tide. And we are super grateful for your time this evening. Again, I just want to take a moment to thank our panelists so much for your time. Thank you for being generous with your personal stories and histories as well, and then your expertise as a professional in this space. We really appreciate your time. And here on this slide, we'll have an opportunity to share your the websites that are associated with our work, and then there are also QR codes for ways to stay engaged. Remember to tweet and post and share about your experience with this virtual film festival. And maybe you'll consider going to another filming as well, or another screening, excuse me. If you found value in today's event, please consider donating. Please donate. Don't consider, just do it to the One Earth Film Fest, and join us again this week, Earth Week in April and throughout the year for further programming. And finally, thank you to each of you in our audience for participating. Let's all give one another a round of applause, even if it's virtual. We really, really appreciate you. And we're going to go make sure that this last slide is up so you can see these different resources. There are screenings all the way through Sunday, so feel free to catch another film this weekend. All right, take care.